Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the PB&J podcast. And I apologize, my setting is a little different today. I'm sorry if I look a little weird. Um, my basement's being remodeled, and so my setup's going to be different. And I'm also not wearing glasses because the screen setup. Anyways,
Ben,
so
you look
we
great.
thank you. I appreciate that. Um, so we have a bit of a different topic today that we're going to be talking about. So Jordan and I are both millennials, and so what we want to talk about is why millennials are not as involved in the church. I know this can be a part of a larger conversation of why are young people either leaving the church or just not being involved in leadership. And that's something that we want to talk about. But because we're both millennials, we want to talk from that experience because we don't want to speak to Zoomers, even though a lot of what we say could probably relate to them. But we're not Zoomers, so we're not going to talk about
Yeah.
that. So that's essentially the conversation for today. So if you're curious about why are young people not as engaged, not as involved in the church, uh, listen in. This should be interesting.
Yeah. So I want to give a disclaimer before we do anything else. We're gonna do some stat backgrounds so you kind of understand what we're talking about. But before that, um, I don't think Ben and I are gonna be so arrogant as to say that we have the answer. And so like none of this podcast is gonna be like, here's 3 steps to fix your young adult ministry. Like it's not like that. I mean, Ben, do you think that's safe to say?
No, we are absolutely going to do that. You have to listen to everything we say. We are going
Okay.
to give you the foolproof approach. Yeah, I'm just kidding.
No, this just went off the rails. But it's totally fine. So yes, Ben is right. We are not doing that because it's not a simple answer. And what we want to touch on is some of the common arguments that you'll hear if you do some digging, but also some personal experience stuff.
Yeah.
I think from just our lifetime and like how we approach the world. One thing that I think is really important as we kind of get into the pod and Ben jump in whenever as I want to talk about, we'll talk about worldview. I will be talking specifically about worldviews quite a bit. And what I mean by that is the way that you approach seeing things, right? Like how you perceive the world around you and how you evaluate values. Not a value system, but like the worldview, which does include that, but other things as well. So a lot of it has to do with collective experience and individual experience. And I think one of the things that we'll talk about is highlight some of the ways that that's been different from other generations and how it might be drastically different from other generations.
Mm.
Um, and why that may be affecting some of the conversation and dialogue, but also some of the ministry strategies because they may not be geared or at least aware of that in a way that can be, I don't want to say engaging, but I'll say compelling or at least not perceived as those two things. Does that make sense, Ben?
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to spoil. I don't want to tip our hand too much. I'm not trying to spoil too much, but
I don't think you
anyway,
spoiled anything.
should I do the stats? Should I do the things?
Yeah, so let's go ahead and start with some basic stats. And I'm sure those of you listening might be familiar with this. So we're
Mhm.
just going to run through these pretty quick, but just to provide a little bit of a glimpse as to the landscape.
Yeah. So we did these same stats on a podcast we did in December. Was it after the insurrection? I don't remember.
Who
No, it was
knows?
before that because it was December. Duh. Anyway, it was one of our earlier podcasts in December. So go back and listen to it if you want the full details of stats. But let's just talk specifically as these stats from both Pew Forum and Gallup. It's a Gallup poll pertain to our generation.
Mhm.
I got them in front of me. Ben, do you have them or do you want me to read them?
I do not. So you go for it.
Awesome. Yay. I'm the numbers guy today. Feels good. All right. So this is straight from Pew. Let's talk about percentage of adults in 2018, 2019 who identify as Christians specifically. So let's just compare us to like the boomers and Gen X. Gen Z wasn't old enough at this point to really be polled, so they're not in this one, but they are in the other one. Baby boomers, 76% of baby boomers identified as Christian. Only 6% of that group identified as non-Christian, and then 17 of those were unaffiliated. So the non-Christian is other faith, and then unaffiliated is hey, I'm not churched at all. Gen X, that number dropped a little bit, 67. Still non-Christian faith at 6%, and then unaffiliated 25%. So that Gen X group, that age group from 65 to 1980, that's the one that had the pretty steep drop off compared to like the peers before that, and actually has a pretty big gap from the unaffiliateds. So then you get millennials where the trend is not going good. My age group was born starting in 1981 to 1996. That is the one they picked for this poll. that's generally pretty close to the range. Some go all the way as far up as 2000, and some go as far back as 1980, but I've never seen anything earlier than that. But 49% of our generation, that's 2018, 2019, so less than half, identify as Christian. Only 9% of us are of other faiths, which is kind of interesting to think about. And then 40% of us are unaffiliated. So there's that 1% fudge factor. So what I want to highlight here is this, that compared to boomers or even Gen X, at the minimum 15% and at the most 23%, so almost a quarter, right? Over a tenth on both of those and almost a quarter on one of my generation is totally unaffiliated and has no like background of Christianity or has actively left the church, which is something to kind of, I don't know. I think it's a worrisome trend, and it's something that we need to be aware of. So the other things I want to talk to you about are straight from the Gallup poll. So let's talk about church membership specifically. Uh, this is different. These are not about religious preference or affiliation. This is about how many people like actually like attend and consider themselves a member. Like these are like, hey, I'm part of this church. So for this one, let me grab these numbers if they load. Here we go. All right. So for my age group, only 42% of my age group is actually a member of a church. So these numbers aren't the same survey, but the idea is as of between 2016 and 2018, only 42% of millennials are members of churches of the group that they surveyed. So compare that to Gen X, which was 54%, or baby boomers, which was 57%. It's fairly steep drop off, not quite as dramatic, but still fairly steep drop off. And those two generations had about 10 and 8% drop off respectively from the last time they did this poll, which was in 1998 to 2000. So what, like 8 years later, something like that. So anyway, that's kind of the rundown there. The last thing I want to highlight is our age group in terms of religious preference. This is not specific to Christian, but this is just the idea that, I would say that I have a background in this. So when we think about how we do ministry, I think a lot of times like churches tend to gear people that have some semblance of Christianity. Like they don't have to teach from scratch, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like a cult would. Sorry, that was a really mean joke. But only 68% of millennials have a religious preference, which means that they like have someone that they'd say, if I was a Jew, or if I was religious, I'd be Jewish. If I was religious, I'd be a Muslim, or if I was religious, I'd be a Christian. Versus 29% would be like, no, there is not a preference for me. I don't care. That doesn't mean straight apathy. It just means that they just don't know, which to me should be an interesting kind of blank slate to start. Compare that to Gen X and boomers. Boomers had an 84% preference on religion, which means they pretty much knew that if I was going to be a practicing person, or if I am a practicing person, this is who I prefer, right? Only 14% of their generation has a no preference. The other two is the fudge factor that's missing. And then Gen X, 79% has a preference and 18% does not. So again, like I want you to think about how steep those drop-offs are and how different they are. And even the dip from boomer to Gen X, which is a fairly unique generation, is only a 5% drop-off. And then it goes like, 11%, like over 10. So it's doubled for that preference with the millennials. So that's kind of the lay of the land. We're not making this up because we're millennials. And this is not some like therapy grief session where we're just going to throw lobs and darts at the church. So Ben, actually, I want you to jump in on this because this is not in this is not in our prep, but I just want to say it as a disclaimer. The church is the bride of Christ. I think it's very, very. Ben told me this one time, and I'm going to steal his quote, so you can just say it if you want. If you want to cut me off, be careful what you say about his bride. Like, just it's not a good thing. But what we're just trying to highlight for you is some of the numbers showing that, like, hey, per our research, like my generation compared to the last two is very much like, yeah, religion's okay, I guess, whatever. I don't really care, or I'm not really that interested in it. So it's a different cultural landscape to navigate ministry within my age group than it would be for Gen Xers and boomers. And even though those generations are very different value wise, the background of like religious openness and like affiliation with Christianity is actually significantly higher and stronger. So versus my age group, which tends to be, I guess you could say, more secular, if that's really the argument, but I would just say maybe less aware and less plugged in with the background in Christianity. Ben, do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. So the rest of our conversation is going to be based on fleshing out those stats, right? Why are those stats the way they are? We're going to do that in a couple ways. One is what we're about to do, which is sort of exploring the background of millennials, like how our upbringing really had an impact on how we behave towards religion and church. And then the other part is going to be exploring some of the, oh, how do I want to put this? So I guess you could say like some of the needs that millennials feel towards religion and church specifically are not being met, and maybe that's something that's keeping us from church. And that's said a little bit harsher than what I think we intend, but I just don't know how else to say that. So onto some of the background. Millennials grew up in a very interesting time, which I think had a major impact on how we behave toward not just church, not even just religion, any sort of organized institutional structure. Because we had some pretty major events happen during our upbringing. Certainly, the rise of the internet had a major impact on how we view the world. Just being exposed to different cultures, different ideas, it made it very hard for us to sift through and decide and really reflect on, what is true, because we were exposed to so many competing not just ideas but worldviews. Certainly, that was highlighted post 9/11
Yeah.
when a lot of the country was now very much exposed to Middle Eastern worldviews
Yeah.
and religions, specifically Islam. There was a lot of difficulty with that and how to wrestle with that. But there was also other events too, and Britt, I don't know if you wanted to explore some of those that had major economic impact and just different changes within the culture.
Sure. So I have a pretty decent list here. So let me start with the economic stuff. So well, yeah. So if for those of you who don't know, I have a background with economics at my job. I work for a financial firm. I can't tell you a lot about it because I have licensing stuff that I can't mess with. But just realize that this is not. I'm not an expert, but I have enough to like at least get through a conversation, and I can live. I can basically swim and not sink is what I'm telling you. So let's talk about specifically the market because that's really kind of where I make my bread and butter on this conversation and what's going on. So millennials have had three different times in our lifetime compared to the two of the other generations, and but also remember how long we've been alive since the earliest 1980, the latest 2000. Three economic crashes. Of the stock market in our lifetime that have had
Yeah.
repercussions for employment specifically and income and a variety of other things. So the first one was the tech crash of 2000. For those of you who don't know, here's all you need to know. We saw the dot-com bubble. We saw dot-com on the end of everything, and we thought views would translate to sales and income on websites. So people drove trade volume, buying and buying and buying dot-coms, thinking they could blow up, trying to find that like moneymaker stock. And it blew up in our faces because none of these companies were actually profitable and they all folded. So then these stocks go to nothing. Well, the problem with that is that like a lot of what happens when that kind of volume drives is that institutional buyers, so like think corporations, 401ks, et cetera, they buy that and use that to generate income or whatever, and that stuff can go away and it can hurt like your
Mm.
ability to pay. And also like remember these companies were startups, so they had like money given to them and they're employing people to do this, but they're not profitable even after they sell all the stock because they just don't know how to manage their business. So they go out and that also kills jobs. So it's a 2-in-1 type deal where it starts on the business side where they can't sustain, so they lay off their staff, and that has repercussions as like a ripple out. So we're going to talk about the theme here in a minute. If you haven't already, I think everybody should watch the movie The Big Short. One, because it's an entertaining film, and two, it's incredibly educational about 2008. The second one was the financial crisis. This was the mortgage-backed securities. Here's all you really need to know. You'll hear people say when they're buying houses, maybe not if you're a millennial because we don't buy houses very often. That was a joke, sorry. My millennial friends will understand. My boomers are going to be really mad. Gen Xers won't care, and Zoomers are on TikTok and not listening. So that's a bad generation for everybody, or a bad assumption about everybody. But the tech bubble crash was really unique because this is the
You
first.
mean the mortgage
Oh, the
crash?
mortgage. Well, the tech bubble too. So let me talk about both these real quick before we talk about the most recent one.
Oh,
This
okay.
one, this one happened because of mortgage-backed securities. People were giving predatory loans and selling your loans in a package because everybody pays their mortgage, and then you could use it to get interest payments. So some companies would even invest money in that to create additional income, and sometimes they would use that for like I don't know. So think of like an endowment at a school like if a like a college professorship, right? Like they may put that money into like those kind of securities to get interest income to use that to pay employees' salary. Well, if those securities, right, that bond goes up in smoke and that interest goes away, so does that position. Those people were our parents, right? So jobs are drying up, extra income's going on, mortgage rates are plummeting, like companies are crashing because they over relied on this for income and different things. Um, Between these two events, the first age group of millennials, like the early part of our generation, our older brethren that are now like their 40s, they came in the workforce around 2000 during the first economic recession and were like, well, crap. So they hang on, they stay with their parents, which is the most millennial thing to do for a little bit longer. And they finally get out there, probably circa 03, 04, do okay for a little bit. Things are kind of getting back up, and then 08 hits. So that older group really got it bad. I was in high school when 08 happened,
Mhm.
which is really unique, because like a lot of my friends who needed extra high school jobs to make money to pay for college, or our parents who were saving for college and had some of these securities to save for college, that all went kaput. Right. So it changed a lot of dreams. I grew up in the Midwest in the Rust Belt. So specifically like plants getting shut down in Anderson, Indiana. My state voted blue for the first time like ever
Hmm.
during that election year because of this event and some of the repercussions. So I just want you to keep that in mind. So the most recent one that we had was what happened this year with the pandemic. Not only do we have to deal with the pandemic, we also had an economic recession and unemployment after finally getting back on the rails from 08. So like this one's kind of funny because we've had dips before, but this one was like real big unemployment because a lot of millennials aren't working your traditional like white collar job, and then the manufacturing jobs typically don't pay well enough. So or they haven't paid well enough for the labor that they feel like is proportionate. There's a big discussion about that I'm not getting into. So they're not popular among my generation all that much per the numbers. But ultimately, like we're now facing our third time where high unemployment rates have disproportionately impacted us, and we're a little salty about it. During that entire time frame that I mentioned from then till now, here's a couple other highlights of small things that we've seen that might actually interest you. And Ben, if you want to talk about any of these, jump on that train.
Okay.
But during that time, we had Columbine, right?
Mhm.
1999, right before the tech bubble burst. So I was a kid before school on the Today, like the Today show was the day after. My mom didn't let me go to school the day after because she didn't like she was just freaked out. Like what is this?
Mhm.
That was an earth shaking event. The second thing is the rise of the internet. I know that seems like really ethereal. What does that mean? The internet became the primary place to do market transactions for business, but it also became like a primary social hub, which is why the
Yeah.
dot-com bubble happened the way it did. Like that event happened because of the rise of the internet, is what I'm telling you. So we were digital natives in the sense that simultaneously in school, when most our previous generations were learning to socialize interpersonally, we were doing that, but also learning how to socialize online, which might be why we have a preference for text over phone calls, right? Because we were doing AIM, Yahoo
Mhm.
Chat, chat boards, all that stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, and if you have anything to say, Ben, like I said, just jump in anytime.
Okay.
Beyond that, we had the video game wars. So like, video games are evil. Mortal Kombat should be banned. Like, and then all like our generation plays a massive amount of video games and online games because that was our platform when we were kids when all this like technology was really coming out.
Yeah.
And then at the end of all that, we had the rise of social media, which now we're seeing can have some negative repercussions.
I do want to say on the video games one, because I am a gamer. That one I think had a lot more impact than people give it credit
Oh, it's
towards
huge.
in terms of how millennials approach the church. Because like online games and games in general, like video games, like they like how like how other people grew up with books and board games and card games. Like we grew up with video, like that was just our medium for hanging out with people. So it was really weird when like even nowadays, like there'll still be some seminars with people saying how video games are just inherently evil. So like if you want to be a good Christian, you can't indulge in any of that. It's a bit how Dungeons and Dragons were treated when it was first out, like back in I think the 70s, where it just sort of ostracized a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I think that attitude itself, I think it had a much wider impact than what we tend to give it credit for. But
Yep.
that, you're right, that is another thing that did happen.
No, it's a
That's pretty significant.
Yeah, but I mean, think about that. Like our exposure to like our innocent, most fun forms of entertainment of playing Zelda was simultaneously being combated by, groups of people that were like, no, this is evil.
Mm,
And you're right. The parallel to draw is what Gen Xers had to deal with their music, right? With like the
mm,
grunge
yeah.
music that they were listening to, or like, Zeppelin backwards as satanic messages or whatever. But also like D&D, like, oh, it's witches and wizards. That's unbiblical. And actually the irony is that some of the early stuff and criticisms, people didn't read early on the Lord of the Rings because it had wizards and stuff in it and the witchcraft, which is really funny to think about. It's like one of the most like
Yeah.
famous, like specifically religious novels. Also, a couple things to figure out, and I think this is a really big one. Google was founded as a search engine, so when we talk about being digital natives, I didn't have to go to the library to find information out. I had to go to my study where my parents let me go on the dial up, you know what I mean, after 10 minutes, and then I could Google stuff. But
Mhm.
with that, because remember, the internet was in its young stages. So it was, I mean, Ben, what did you call it in the pre show? The Wild West.
It was the Wild West days.
And it was to some extent, right? It's like the Wild West internet days. Like, I mean, that means that you could easily stumble on stuff that your parents wouldn't let you read, or you wouldn't even have like the ability to understand. So like
Yeah.
our world got bigger faster.
Very fast. Like
And
you could do a Google search and find yourself in very weird places.
yeah, and like
Sometimes very questionable places.
yeah,
Just not on purpose. It's just it opened up everything.
and we're not even talking about like, let's just say, I'm not specifically even just talking about porn or anything. Like, yes, that was a consequence, but like more stuff than that. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, like uh, forums for like people with depression, like, maybe like music, or I'm trying to think of some good examples. Like, I mean, the Columbine kids, they were using the
Mhm.
internet to like post and look up plans for weapons and stuff. So, I mean, just that kind of information was so accessible at
Yeah.
that
Like you could
time.
yeah, stuff that nowadays would not be allowed in the internet. Sort of like the oh, I forget what it's called. There's actually a term, the dark web or the dark net. I think it's the dark web, which is actually a thing where there's like forums and stuff for like legally dubious conversations
Yeah.
and very like it's the crazy side of the internet.
Yeah.
But like
It's,
all of that, like it was totally unrestricted back in the early days.
yeah.
And so that had a major impact on things that we were exposed to, the knowledge that we were aware of and the things that we were familiar with. But also, the scary stuff, but also things like being like interacting with different worldviews and different ideas, different religious
Much
beliefs,
easier.
hearing from different opinions. Like your social circles expanded a lot.
Yeah. And we weren't
And that was something
regionally.
else we had to wrestle with
Mhm.
too. Like, how do you navigate all
Yeah,
this?
and we weren't necessarily regionally tied, you know what I mean? Because like,
Yeah.
it was easy to talk to a kid from New York,
Hmm.
if you just had their AIM information, and that sounds silly, but think about, like, even the differences in, like, where kids grow up and, like, the value systems, like, where people grow up state to state or traditions and stuff. Like, the sharing of those things is a big deal, which actually kinda ties into the next thing. We grew up in the big push for diversity within schools and, like, inclusivism, the start of inclusivism. So when my generation, like, harps on diversity, it's because it's a value that's been instilled into us before we even knew about it. Uh, and I don't know if that was like, who where that came from, but that was a big deal to us, is that like representation, but diversity in general. Like, we wanted to make sure that like it was a big deal. Uh,
Hmm.
Basically, we didn't want to exclude people. So like one of the things that happened was like the girls' power movement like was going on in the 90s. Well, it started in the 80s really, but like really kind of got steam in the 90s. So like girls' sports participation was a big deal. I don't want to like, I feel like I shouldn't speak to this because I don't have a lot to say on it because I was so young. But like those kind of things too, like it was normal. Like it's hard for me to conceptualize a world where like girls don't play sports. Like it just,
Yeah, I don't have any experience with that either,
yeah,
thinking about it. Like those just weren't ideas or even like things divided by race even.
yeah,
Like I just don't remember any of those conversations
yeah.
taking place.
And that's a good thing. Like that's actually a
Yeah.
credit to previous generations, real quick. That like, I mean, like, because there are boomers that grew up like in places that were segregated that were under Jim Crow laws. Like their first couple
Mhm.
memories before, like they can remember like things being repealed and schools being integrated. Like that's a thing. And like I don't want to make light of that because I know my generation is pretty contentious with boomers, but like that's a big deal. But like think about how like you had to see that change and like that was different versus me. That was the standard. That was normal. Like it'd be weird to have it any other way versus you, like you had to adjust to that. And that's just kind of like a basic level view there. A couple other things I would say, and then Ben, you can jump in with anything else. Is like we had the Oklahoma City bombing, so and then 9/11, so terrorism. So we had to deal with the rise of the internet, that kind of stuff. I would say to some extent, they did studies. They say that, like, quote unquote, so this is a weird study, but millennials were exposed to adult issues earlier. I just
Yeah.
don't know how you distinguish what an adult issue is, but it's
Like politics and even like international relations.
yeah,
Like that was stuff that we just grew up in that world.
yeah,
Like that's just second. Like we just know those conversations
yeah.
pretty well. I think
I
just because
was
that was us.
I was 9 when 9/11 happened in 2001. So,
Mm,
like, I guess I'm telling you my age, but when that happened, like, I mean, it was normal to talk about politics and like post-war, pre-war. So I was 9 years old, and like literally, when my parents watched the news at night, instead of hearing the feel-good story about what was going on in Indianapolis, it was like, should we go to Iraq and Iran? I don't know. What do you think? Let's toss it over to Wolf. Like that kind of stuff. Like, and like that was just like the world we grew up in, right? It wasn't like, the goofy news stories you see on YouTube from like the 70s or 60s or 80s, where they're like,
mhm.
this man ate 2 McDonald's French fries, large French fries, in under 30 seconds. How did he do it? Like not that like that's the only thing that was on there, but like those stories I think became less and less frequent because we grew up in a society that was more about like the interest in those bigger events.
Yeah.
And the last thing that I thought was a really interesting thing that we kind of have to deal with was we were statistically busier because our parents tended to want to get us into good colleges better. So we were more likely to go through like SAT prep classes than like our Gen X or
Yeah.
Boomer counterparts, partially because those things didn't exist back then. And
Mhm.
the other part because our parents created them and then wanted us to do them. So,
Very much a push for higher education.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
In whatever capacity that meant. Like I never took SAT prep classes, but I was very much to the point of it being incredibly annoying when school counselors would not let me take certain classes based on how they would affect my ability to get into higher education. Like it's a little messed up and
yeah,
a bit
like, because
forced.
maybe you want to take wood chop, like maybe you just like,
That's actually what it was. I
yeah.
wanted to take woodshop and they wouldn't let me because they said it wouldn't look good on a college resume. And I'm like,
And that's,
whatever.
yeah, that's crazy to me because like I actually, like, I have a college degree. I've built shelves for my family. I like to do. I'm not a good woodworker, probably because I didn't take wood shop, but I would have loved that class because it's something that as a hobby I'm interested in doing. I don't want to be a carpenter. Like like I
Mhm.
don't want to do that, but like I would have loved to have more experience and not be self taught from watching my dad and my grandpa. I just Anyway, and I'm neither here nor there. Just a random thought. Yes, Ben, I feel you. That makes me mad too. Um, Millennial outrage. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But that's kind of the background. So, like, I want you to think about like those events, right? Like, so, like our worldview and our foundation, and again, jump on this, Ben, whenever you want, was kind of
Yeah,
like,
I
huh?
will interrupt you. I'm sorry. I
No,
will say
dude,
one other major thing that had an impact was I don't know how I want to word this. I don't want to say religious extremism, but almost a little bit. Because we
no.
also grew up during the time when Left Behind became a very popular book series. And with that came a lot of very intense conversations regarding things like rapture, regarding things like Christ's second coming and judgment
Well,
and
Y2K.
how, yeah. And so Y2K was another big thing. And that really framed not just conversations in the church, that had a major impact on how we were raised to perceive our personal relationships with other people. Like that really shaped how I viewed my friendships, like and not in a healthy way either. So we were in those conversations, and it, and all that, and also sort of the decline of the Billy Graham style evangelism, but a lot of churches wanting to retain that, and so there was always that sort of tension in the church where uh, maybe this is more my experience. Jordan, let me know if maybe I'm going a little off base here, but sort of where being raised in the church as a millennial, you're raised with this worldview of uh, a world that existed in the 50s and 60s. And so a lot of what we were taught in terms of how do you live out your Christian faith simply didn't apply to our lives. And so that made it really difficult to navigate. And we actually had to, at least myself, I had to answer a lot of those questions myself. Like, what does it mean to be a Christian? Because the church simply wasn't helping. And so
Well, they didn't know how. I don't
because the
think.
world was changing so
Yeah.
fast, and the church was also changing really fast. Again, going back to the whole eschatology conversation left behind, but they were just moving in very different directions to the point where in an interview I had one time, I actually could accurately tell the person, like, I feel like I am an intercultural interpreter. because I grew up in the church, but I also grew up in a public school. And doing that alone, like you have to learn how to navigate living in two different worldviews and living according to two very different value systems. And that had a major impact on how millennials were raised. Would you say that's accurate, Jordan?
Yeah, I think so. What I would say specifically would be like in reference to dispensationalism, right? Like that was a big deal. Like we grew up, and I would say that our experience in church is one that kind of has felt like a bit distrustful.
Yeah.
Um, I think that you're right that we were being taught a worldview and like how things ought to be that maybe felt more reminiscent of what we would assume the 60s and 50s would be like. Probably it was, if we're being honest, it was probably closer to the 70s and 80s. I don't really know. I wasn't there, but like I'm just assuming. I'm just trying to give them the doubt and make sure that they're a
Yeah.
couple decades sooner. Again, no idea because I wasn't there for any of this any of those decades mentioned. But you get my point.
Yeah.
That's me trying to be graceful and not knowing how. Anyway, that's the deal. So yes, I agree with that. One thing I will say is that on top of that, though, like I mean, think about like the terrorism stuff and like the world going to heck, and then Y2K. Like that was this New Year's Eve in 2000 or 1999 was the scariest night of my life. I'm not even
Mhm.
joking. Like I was terrified. It still is weird to think about. Like I legit thought that like it was all going to be over, and like the big books that are hitting the shelves are these fundamentalist dispensational books left behind and stuff. And like it's just you're right, Ben. Like there's like this feeling like it's gonna end, and then life goes on and it's good and you feel good, but you can't help but feeling like you kind of got like told something
Gypped a
that
little bit.
yeah,
Yeah.
you're like
Well, not
why
gypped, but just deceived.
yeah, and you're like why what it's like every other time like computers are fine. You know what I mean? Like, why is this the end of the world? I don't understand. And on one sense, you have this age group that's not really comfortable with technology and doesn't understand it, and they're like really anti. Like, this is leading us down the path of like this, and typically they can even be religious, and they put that framework on it if you're a Christian, and it's like really weird. So, like, I think I actually pulled up a list from like a website about like um, what millennial values are. And it says one
Mhm.
characteristic is challenges the hierarchy and status quo. Well, I think that comes because like, no offense, you told us stuff and we listened to you and then it didn't happen. Like
Yeah,
this is,
exactly.
yeah. And this is going to be super political and it's going to be super mean. And I don't mean it to be that, but I want you to think about this though. Like after 9/11, we had that whole war and the war in Iraq, right? And then we went over there to find nuclear warheads and we didn't find nuclear warheads.
Mhm.
And it just felt weird. I don't know if you remember that, but as a kid, I remember
Yeah.
thinking, I don't understand. Like, and I didn't know how to compute and put those things together. And I was like 10, 11 at that point. You know what I mean? I was pretty young.
Yeah. And then
Um,
even when like good stuff did happen, like when Saddam Hussein was captured and arrested, it was like, oh, now the world's gonna get better. And it's like,
but it
but it
doesn't.
didn't really change that much. Like, yeah, like we definitely grew up feeling deceived. Like we were raised, when Y2K happened, like even Leonard Nimoy was telling us the world is gonna end. And then you look out the window, 1 second past midnight, 1 hour past midnight on January 1st, 2000, and the world goes on like, oh, okay, fool me once. And then, yeah, the whole war on terrorism, which just created a huge mess. Yeah, there was some good stuff that happened, but it's still the same world we live in, and there's still threats out there. So it's like, okay, well, that didn't fix anything either. And then the economic crashes, like, yeah, it showed a lot of distrust. So
Yeah.
it's like, it's no wonder young people are so cynical.
Yeah. And it's also like one of the things that we really value though is like authenticity because I feel like what we're saying is that feels rare
Mhm.
and that openness is not common for us. Do you think that's fair to say, Ben?
Yeah, yeah,
Because it's always felt disingenuous because like you can always explain away motives, or at least what it's felt like. So can I found this list, Ben. It's not in our prep, but I found a list of 10. This is from an employing website. It's indeed.com. It's like when you're doing an interview, here's like an informational thing about when you're doing millennials. Here's some things that they value. So when you ask questions, maybe don't be like terrified if they say something this way because this is what they might mean. Can I read these
yeah,
list of 10? Are you interested in
yeah.
that? All right.
Hmm.
So one is values meaningful motivation, which is not just authoritative. It's like coaching over authority. Like, so like discussing, you know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
this is why we do this. Because I think we grew up in the generation of like, no, the world's going to end because it's Bible says so. And it's like, and it didn't. And we were like,
Yeah.
Did it say that?
Yeah. You're gonna have to convince me, like, why? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
what the big
Like,
question of why? Give me the
and
why.
I think we get called entitled for that. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's not too. But like, can you at least understand where we're coming from if we
Yeah.
feel like we've been disappointed a lot? Like, if the economy didn't get better, the world didn't fix itself overnight. You know what I mean? Like, and it
Mhm.
didn't end. Like, we're kind of like, okay. The second thing is that we challenge the hierarchy and status quo. We've talked about that, so we don't need to beat it unless you have anything else to say about it.
Nope.
Um, Places importance on relationships with superiors, so relationship focused with management and leaders rather than like authoritative again. So kind of goes back to the first one.
Yeah.
This is a midlife.
So, well, I guess I want to flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah.
So, it that it doesn't mean valuing positions of authority. It just
Yes.
means like actually valuing relationships. Like, treat me like a person, I will treat you like a person. Like, that's big.
Like being real, so to speak, with each other.
Yeah, we tend to put our faith in people, not in the
Institutions.
the system of hierarchies, essentially.
Yeah,
So
no,
yeah,
you're
you're
right.
right. It does double back to that second point. I just wanted to clarify.
No, you're good. I'm glad you clarified. The fourth one you're going to laugh at: intuitive knowledge of technology. I
Yep.
I don't know if we need an explanation on that. Uh, Five, open and adaptive to change. We've lived in a world that's literally been accelerating since we were born. So like
Yeah.
change is my language. Nothing has been
Mhm.
similar. You know.
Yeah.
Uh, I know that sounds dumb, but like I'm just not afraid of change because that's all I know. Uh, Six, places importance on tasks rather than time. So getting the job done right rather than getting it done on time.
Mhm.
That's interesting. I don't know if we can explain that. Um, anyway, neither here nor there. We'll leave that out. That's for employers. So, like, fun fact: passion for learning. This is makes a lot of sense though, based on our exposure to the
Yes.
internet, right?
Yeah.
Like, we got to see a really big world from a really young age, and it's natural to want more of it.
Yeah. Like, one of the common examples, and it's so true, is like get with a group of young people, like 30s and younger, maybe even a little older, and just talk regular, like be in conversation and see how long it takes for someone to pull out their phone and say, I'm going to look that up.
Yeah,
Like, my wife and I do that all the time. Like, we're watching a TV show, someone will say something and be like, is that true? I don't know. Let's see. Or like, oh, I wonder what's going on here. Like, it's constantly researching, really, like
yeah.
wanting to know things.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason that we're called like so political is because we like
Mhm.
to look up what's actually happening. We want to know. Like we're not. I don't think that we're totally reliant on the traditional news. Like watch it at 6 o'clock at night, and that's all you need to do.
Yeah.
6 and 6, right? We don't do that. And more to the point, you're right. Like that's why we're passionate about higher education because it was stressed to us as a cultural value. Like as our parents put us in these SAT prep programs or schools, like we're designed around getting to this good college, and I think we just love learning because we just like enjoy it as a culture, and we've shown that some of the things that we've got to experience as a young age was good. So Ben, you said it really well. Um, Moving forward, openly receptive to feedback and recognition. I don't really know how I to say on that one. That's probably more specific to work, but sure,
Yeah.
why not? I don't disagree, I guess. This is a big one: free thinking and creative.
Yes.
And it makes sense though, right? Like
Yeah.
we didn't have like we're not latchkey kids where we were just like independent. Like we were kind of structured. So like this is kind of our time to be independent. But moreover, like, we tend to be really value creativity because it's like an outpouring of who you are. You're not just doing the status quo. That's my interpretation of that. So free thinking, like I don't just want to do
Hmm.
what's always been done.
Yeah.
Um, Probably has a lot to do with change. And then values social interactions within a workplace, but values social interactions probably is the full stop there in general.
Right.
We're a very sociable generation.
Hmm.